You know, sometimes a story, it really makes you stop and think. It's heartbreaking, infuriating even, and just leaves you with so many questions. And that's what we're looking at today. The Impact Plastics Factory during Hurricane Helene. Over 200 lives were lost during that storm. But we're narrowing our focus today just on this one factory in Erwin, Tennessee. 11 people went to work and never came home. So we're going to try to understand what happened.
Yeah, it really highlights the human cost of a disaster like Hurricane Helene.
Hmm.
And it brings up these questions of responsibility, like what happens when disaster strikes? What do we owe to each other?
Exactly. So taking a look at the CNN article by Alicia Abrahimji and Carol Alvarado, it lays out what happened at the factory. 11 workers gone, swept away by the floodwaters on September 27th. And they were reportedly trying to escape the rising water when it happened.
And it's so tragic because the story is told from two different sides. You have Impact Classics, the company, and then you have what the workers and their families are saying. And the two, well, they don't exactly tell the same story.
Right. Okay. So what is it that Impact Plastics is saying?
Their official statement, it says that all the employees were told to leave 45 minutes before the flood hit. They're very clear that nobody was kept from leaving and that everybody had more than enough warning to get out.
But we're hearing something else from the people who are actually there, right?
Yes. And that's where those different points of view are important. Like Jacob Ingram. He was there, one of the lucky ones who got out. He's quoted in the article saying he asked if he could leave. He saw the water, but they told him, no, not yet.
Wow. So even though there was a clear danger, they were told to just keep working.
That's what it sounds like. And there's more. One worker, who wanted to stay anonymous, shared this chilling detail. They said there was only one way in or out of the factory. And when they were finally told they could go, the flood had blocked that one exit.
So they were trapped. That's terrifying.
It is. And you think about that feeling. There's nothing you can do. You're at the mercy of someone else, especially at a time like that. And it completely contradicts Impact Plastics, saying that the front of the plant appears to have been passable.
Makes you wonder, if they'd twist the truth about that, what else are they not being honest about?
That's a very good question. Hopefully that's something investigators will look into. But before we get to that, I think we need to stop for a second to think about what this has cost people. These weren't just names on a news report. They were real people with families and hopes and dreams, lives that were cut way too short.
And I think the story of Bertha Mendoza really drives that home.
Her story, it shows that gap between what the company says and what the workers went through.
For those who don't know, what happened to Bertha?
Bertha was one of the workers who got caught in the flood. And right before the water swept her away, she was able to call her husband. Just imagine that for a moment. You know the water's rising, your phone's about to die, you know your life is in danger. What do you say?
I can't. My heart breaks for her family.
She used those last few moments to tell her children that she loved them. Knowing the phone would get wet, knowing it might be her last chance. It really, really makes this whole tragedy hit home.
And Monica Hernandez, we can't forget about her. She was another worker who lost her life. Her niece said she always had a smile. She brought joy to everybody around her, a mother, grandmother, friend, colleague.
And her loss, just like everyone else we're talking about today, it leaves a hole that can't be filled. And because of that loss, it's hard to understand what the company's saying, because they're also saying nobody actually died on their property, even though later their founder talks about the loss of colleagues and friends.
Trying to distance themselves from what happened.
It's strange. It makes you wonder about their priorities, and it reminds me of what Jarvis said in the article. It broke my heart to see that they died. All because of greed, I think. Now, it's important to remember we can't jump to conclusions, but it's a feeling you hear a lot in cases like this, that maybe the company cared more about making money than the safety of its workers.
Awful. It raises the question of worker vulnerability, especially when it comes to these jobs that are dangerous, physically demanding jobs. And we know these extreme weather events are becoming more common. So as this happens more and more, where does the responsibility lie? What should employers be doing?
Those are really the questions we should be asking. If these extreme weather events are going to keep happening, what can we do to make sure people are safe? How do you balance making money, the economy, with something as valuable as human life? I mean, think about it. The hospital, just a mile away from the factory, they were evacuating people from their roof because of the flood. If the hospital wasn't safe, how could that factory have been safe?
It's like they were living in two different worlds.
Yeah. Thankfully, investigators are asking those same questions. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the Tennessee Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they're both looking into it, trying to find out what happened, who knew what and when, and if any laws were broken or any safety rules.
The families deserve answers. It's the least they can do.
They do. But there's something else I found that's really troubling. When that CNN article was published, Impact Plastics still hadn't reported the deaths.
Wait, what? But isn't that, a legal requirement?
It is. When there's a death at work, the employer has 8 hours to report it to OSHA. But days had passed, and still no report. That says something. Like maybe there's more to this, that Impact Plastics doesn't want us to know.
So now what? What happens next?
Well, the investigations are still going on, and hopefully we'll get some answers. But even if they find out everything that happened, it doesn't erase what the survivors and the families are going through.
Right. Nothing can bring back the people they lost.
Exactly. And it makes you think about what Robert Jarvis, one of the workers who got out, said. He asked, "Why'd you make us work that day?" Why? We shouldn't have worked. We shouldn't have been there. None of us should have been there.
Haunting. And it really makes you think, why were they there? And this idea of worker safety, it feels even more important now. These extreme weather events are becoming more and more common.
Yeah, and we see this a lot, don't we? When does pushing for productivity go too far? At what point are you putting your employees at risk? And these aren't just things we're thinking about. This is real life. And as we're seeing in this case, the consequences are very real too.
And it doesn't feel like Impact Plastics really gets it. The way they're talking about this, it's so different from what people actually live through.
It does feel like there are two completely different stories here. And that just shows why it's so important to hear from everyone involved, especially the people who are actually affected. In their statement, Impact Plastics talks about the gigantic force of the flood, almost like it was this totally random thing, something nobody could have predicted or stopped. They even said, while we feel confident that all procedures were followed, we are reviewing our emergency protocols.
Right, like it was just a freak accident and there was nothing anyone could do. But if you look at the timeline, the warnings, what the workers have said, even that the hospital had to evacuate, it doesn't sound like this was some kind of surprise.
It really seems like there were plenty of warning signs. And don't forget, Impact Plastics also said that nobody died at the factory. But Unicoi County Sheriff Mike Hensley said that's not true. He said 5 bodies were found downstream and 6 were found at the plant.
Sounds like someone's trying to control the story, almost as if Impact Plastics just wants to forget this ever happened.
It does make you wonder about their priorities. And it takes us back to what Jarvis said, that quote from the article. It broke my heart to see that they died, all because of greed, I think. Now, it's important that we don't assume anything, but you hear that a lot in situations like this, that maybe the company put their profits ahead of the safety of their workers.
It's just heartbreaking. And it makes you think about the bigger picture, how vulnerable workers are, especially in jobs that are physically demanding or dangerous. And now we're seeing these extreme weather events happening more and more. So where's the line? What are employers supposed to do in these situations?
Exactly the conversation we need to be having. As these extreme weather events become more frequent, how do we make sure the people most at risk are safe? How do we balance things like profits and the economy with something as important as a human life? It's a tough question, but it's one we have to ask.
We do, and we need to start thinking differently. The old ways of doing things, how we used to think about risk, it just doesn't work anymore. Not in a world where climate change is the reality.
Right. And this tragedy at Impact Plastics, it forces us to look at some hard truths about what we value as people, as a society. What are we willing to let slide in the name of making money or getting the job done?
And more practically, what can we actually do to make sure something like this never happens again? Do we need stricter rules, better enforcement of the rules? Companies need to take more responsibility.
Probably all of the above. We definitely need stricter safety rules, especially for those jobs and workplaces that are more likely to be affected by extreme weather. But rules without consequences are useless, right?
Yeah.
So we need to make sure companies know there will be real repercussions if they prioritize profit over the well-being of their employees.
Because when you strip it all away, this is about people's lives. 11 people who went to work and never came home.
And we owe it to them, to their families, to everyone, to learn from what happened. We need to be asking those tough questions, demanding better, and working toward a future where we don't have to wonder, why were we there?
Yeah. It's a question that should never have to be asked. And on that note, Let's continue this conversation because when we come back, we're going to be talking about what this tragedy means for the future of work in a world that's dealing with climate change. It's easy to get lost in the weeds a little bit with the different stories and the investigations, but at its core, this is about people. Those 11 people who went to work and never made it back home.
Yeah, it reminds us, every one of these tragedies, these stories, these statistics, it's people. It's lives that are cut short, families that are changed forever, a whole community trying to cope with this unbelievable loss.
It really makes you think, what can we take away from this? How can we keep something like this from happening again? Because we keep saying it, but this wasn't just a one-time thing. And as the climate changes, as we see more extreme weather, it's only going to get riskier for everybody, but especially for those workers in physically demanding or dangerous
And
jobs.
that's why we have to rethink worker safety from the ground up. The old ways, just waiting for something bad to happen and then reacting, it's not enough anymore. We need to be ahead of it, see the risks coming, and actually do something about them before it's too late.
So how do we do that? Where do we even start? What can we actually do to make things safer for workers, especially as the climate changes?
I think the first step is admitting that climate change isn't just an environmental problem. It affects workplaces, worker safety. It's a human rights issue, and it's an economic issue. We can't be afraid to have those hard conversations about what's really important.
So it's about a change in values. It's not just about chasing profits anymore. People's lives, their safety, their well-being, that has to come first.
Exactly. And it's bigger than just individuals changing. The whole system needs to change. Stronger regulations, real enforcement. Companies need to be held accountable. We need a system that rewards them for putting safety first and punishes them if they cut corners or put profits ahead of their workers.
So almost like a new way of thinking, a new agreement where workers' rights and well-being are the priority, especially now as we face the challenges of a changing climate.
I think that's a great way to put it. We all need to be on the same page. The workers, the CEOs, the people making the rules, everyone realizing we're in this together and that the decisions we make today are going to affect generations to come.
It's a lot to think about, a lot to process, but if we can just learn something from this, if we can make some positive change because of what happened, then those lives lost at Impact Plastics, it won't have been for nothing.
That's what we have to believe, that even with a loss this big, this awful, we can find the strength, the courage to work together and build a better future. A future where why were we there is a question nobody ever has to ask again.
It's a question that should never have to be asked. And with that, we'll have to leave it there for today. Remember the victims of the Impact Plastics tragedy. Honor their memory by demanding better, pushing for change, and doing everything we can to prevent something like this from ever happening again.